Hello kind people, this is my second take of the highlight video for round 3 of Tata Steel Chess 2019. The first one was humming along nicely when I realized I forgot to unmute the mic, so I am at a slightly lower level of cheerfulness than I was a minute ago, but we'll persevere. With that, I think the introduction should be done with. For round 3, we are not choosing a game featuring any of the Dutch players who, up until that moment, were providing all the excitement and all the decisive games. Well, not all the excitement, but definitely all the decisive games in the tournament. For my highlight of round 3, I'm choosing a game played by the two Russians, Ian Nepomniachtchi on the white side against Vladimir Kramnik with black. Their tournaments up to that point were sort of drastically different. Jan beat Anish Giri with the black pieces seemingly effortlessly in round 1, and then drew a fighting game against Magnus Carlsen in which he spent, I think, maybe 15 minutes on the entire game in round 2, whereas Kramnik was completely lost against Timur Rajabov in round 1, and then did lose against the very same Anish Giri with the white pieces in round 2. So I think they were kind of, as much as possible, polar opposites coming into the game. And maybe against Kramnik in his previous incarnation, this would have meant he will play safely. But we know this about Vladimir Kramnik in his current state. He is not interested at all in playing safe. He is not interested at all in showing his homework and going home. So we were always, I think, very likely to get an interesting game, and we did get it. Let's look at what happened. Jan opened with one e4. He also plays a lot of one c4 on move 1, but e4 is his main move. e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, castles, knight takes e4, and rook e1. Not the most auspicious beginning, to be honest. At least that's what we thought when this appeared on the board, because the rook e1 anti-Berlins are generally very, very dry and very well analyzed, in particular by Kramnik himself, who is the world's leading specialist on all things to do with Berlin. But once again, these days you don't need to give Kramnik an interesting position to expect an interesting game. You just need to get him to the board, and then he does all of that work on his own. Bishop f1, takes, castles, d4, bishop f6, rook e1, rook e8, c3, takes, knight e8. I'm going through this extremely fast because all of this obviously is heavily theoretical, and this used to be a position where white would automatically play something like bishop f4, d5, bishop d3, or something along those lines anyway. And the game would be, in most cases, agreed drawn by move 25 because the situation, I mean, the structure is completely symmetrical and the margins are sort of small to non-existent here for white to achieve something. But then they found out you can play d4, d5 instead in this position. And that move sometimes gives white a significant advantage. For instance, Magnus Carlsen won a very nice game against Levon Aronian, where I think Levon played something like d6, knight d2, bishop g5, seemingly very logical, and then never really came close to equalizing. Therefore, a lot of attention has been paid to this move recently, and I think the conclusion, at least as I understand it, I'm not a huge specialist on this line, is that black is supposed to play c6 here. This is what Fabiano Caruana has done against Giri in the Batumi Olympiad, and in the same Olympiad, Luke McShane even lost this position with white to Timur Rajabov. And white generally replies to this by just leaving this pawn on prise. For instance, Giri played knight d2, knight f3 here. Black brings the knight over to c7 and then very often to e6. And these types of positions are really not supposed to be very much at all for white. I'm sure that Jan did not come completely empty-handed and he had some kind of an idea how to test Kramnik in this position, but generally you would expect Kramnik to, first of all, know what the equality is here, and secondly, being able to demonstrate it. But what is lacking there is the desire to demonstrate the equality, and d5 was immediately met by b7, b6. Which is also a playable move, but it's a move which gives white much more scope for fighting for advantage. The plan obviously is to play bishop b7, and then white will have a bit of a tough time if he is not prepared, obviously. After something like knight d bishop b7, for instance, it's not that easy to protect the pawn on d5 comfortably. But knight d2 is an autopilot move, which you cannot really expect. Ian played bishop f4, bishop b7, and queen d2. And it is sort of already too late to play c7, c6 here. On some level too late, and on some level too early, as you will see in a moment. But if you do it in this particular position with the pawn still on c3, White can actually play d5, d6, and it becomes very, very difficult to challenge this pawn on d6, and the knight on e8 is also completely stuck, which makes for a problematic situation for Black. You can fight here, but I think objectively White is already quite significantly better. In view of all that, Kramnik played h6. The idea of h6 followed by bishop g5, trading these bishops, is very, very topical, and it's quite logical to do it here. Black also creates space for his king, so he doesn't have back rank problems in the future. Played c4. Trying to play c4 followed by knight c3 and rook e1 is of course much more harmonious than just playing knight a3, because that's the only square available to the knight now. And after knight a3, bishop g5 already, Black would have zero problems whatsoever. c4, and here Black could play bishop g5, knight c3, and let's say takes, queen f6. It's not horrible at all, but Vladimir instead chose c6, aiming for sort of more difficult strategic positions. Fewer trades, at least for the time being. Knight c3, cd5. It's very important to keep the bishop on b7 on the board. It would be a big mistake to take on d5 and allow Black to trade it off. Maybe you could take with the queen, it would be sensible, but giving up a whole pawn on b2 for that feels wrong. And if you take with the pawn and allow bishop g5, Black is sort of immediately fine, because the bishop on b7, which as you can see is no longer there on the board, was by far his worst piece. So Ian took with the pawn, and here I think, somewhat surprisingly, Vladimir's next three moves are all mistakes of various magnitude, but all of them I feel are slightly imprecise. First of all, you need to solve the question of what to do with the knight on e8. And you can do it, for instance, by playing bishop g5, once again preparing this trade of the bishops. And also, very importantly, giving the knight, at least in some sort of distant future, the option of going to f6. And after, let's say, rook e1, Black can make a somewhat useful move a7, a6 here, stopping potential jumps to the b5 square, and start trading and sort of expanding on the queen side. Eventually, Black will play rook c8, the queen will go to either d6 or maybe in some positions back to d8. In particular, after bishop d3, it makes sense not to blunder the queen takes c8 threat, which leads to mate in 2, so you go queen d8 here. And then the knight will come out to f6, the rook will go to c8. And yes, White still has somewhat more space here, but I think Black should hold eventually. The move that Kramnik made, d7, d6, is not really horrible as such, but in his desire to sort of play a more complicated game, because I think bishop g5 is a move you make in almost all of your blitz games that reach this position. It's just very, very natural to try and trade some pieces. But d6 is sort of fine in and of itself, but I think it was connected with the wrong idea. Ian made the most obvious move in the position, rook e1, and Vladimir played knight c7. This already is, I think, a significant problem, because it just doesn't belong on this square. There's absolutely no reason for Black to put this knight on this square, and it was better to play queen d7 with the intention of, first of all, improving the position of your queen a little bit. You do not blunder bishop b5 here, because it's met by bishop takes c3. And if White plays bishop c4, which is something that he has done in the game as a reply to knight c7, you can take on c3, follow it up by knight f6, and after both bc3, let's say b5, bishop b3, knight f6, and somewhat more trickily, queen takes c3, knight f6. And I say somewhat more trickily because here White has this tactical shot bishop h6, which might look scary for a second, and then you realize that after rook c8, it is White has to be extremely careful, because it's difficult to organize some kind of coordination for his pieces. Both of his bishops are sort of on prise, and after some thought, the computer suggests that the only move to make here that doesn't lose is h2, h3. Already not very difficult, not very easy to find, but the point is you want to play queen g3 next move, and you need to stop queen g4. And here black is perfectly fine after about a half dozen moves. Queen f5 is fine, rook c4 is fine. Almost everything here leads to some kind of equality. In view of all that, after queen d7, White probably decides not to allow bishop takes c3, goes knight e4, and black can play bishop e5, which would be completely fine for the fact that White can take and make this very strong move back, knight e4, c3, attacking the pawn on e5, before the knight can land on d6, which is very, very important. If you give black time enough to play knight d6 and follow it up by rook e8, black would be instantly fine, but unfortunately it loses the central pawn. In view of that, after knight e4, black can wait for a move and play rook d8. And you don't really have to be scared about knight takes e6, because takes, bishop c4 and queen f5 immediately creates enough counterplay against the d5 pawn for black not to have to worry about much. So I think queen d7 was stronger than knight c7. But Vladimir played knight c7, bishop c4, and here comes, I think, the final mistake. Not the final mistake of the game, you can find more inaccuracies later on, but the mistake which really turned the evaluation and made this position very, very difficult to play for black. Here he took on c3, instead of which, once again, he should have played queen d7, aiming to play rook e8, if allowed, let's say if White makes some kind of a waiting move like bishop g3, to have an additional option maybe in some positions of playing f4 after bishop e5. I mean, not here, bishop e5 blunders a pawn, but for instance after rook e8, knight e4, you can no longer really play bishop e5 here because f4 is very strong. But in this position, black can just play bishop e7, follow it up probably by bishop f8 at some point, and then he will start very seriously considering, let's say, playing f5, maybe even playing f5 immediately, following it up by returning the bishop to f6. And this position, I believe, is quite playable for black. And if White decides to play faster and meets queen d7 with the immediate knight e4, you can play bishop e5, bishop takes e5, d, knight c3, once again the same motif. And in this position, the computer, to my slight surprise, really dislikes a position after queen d6, queen e3, rook e8, and some waiting rook h3. Mainly, I think, because of just how stupid this knight on c7 is. And the queen on d6 is a poor blocker, and eventually it will get pushed away and the d-pawn might start running. But instead of playing into White's hands by playing queen d6, you can play b6, b5, introducing this idea of before attacking the pawn on d5. And probably black is still slightly worse after something like bishop b3, or maybe even bishop f1 in some cases, but black should have enough counterplay against the pawn on d5 after something like rook d8 followed by b5, b4 to eventually make a draw. It's not going to be an easy draw, it's not going to be an effortless draw where you don't even have to think about your moves. But you should not lose this position, I believe. But as mentioned, Vladimir took on c3, b takes, queen f6. Here Ian played h3, which is a very normal human move to make. There probably were some more energetic ideas, but I think, once again, securing the back rank is very understandable. And here, during the live broadcast, we were making an argument that Kramnik was basically playing to complicate the position, not playing rook e8 here. But having looked at this with the machine, I realized that a position like this takes, let's say bishop b3, bishop e8, c4, bishop d7. It's an important thing for black to achieve, to get the bishop at least to some squares where it does something. On b7 it really wasn't doing anything at all. But a position like this with this knight on e8 extremely stupid and the pawn on d6 very weak. You probably don't lose if you defend very, very carefully for a very, very long time, but you will hate every moment of it. And you cannot possibly claim that this is equal. White will be enjoying this quite a bit. For instance, you can transfer the bishop over to d4 and then start pushing the a pawn, trying to undermine the pawn on b6, create additional weaknesses on the queen side. But mainly it's just this knight on e8, which has absolutely no future. So I think, in particular, having seen what happened in the game, rook e8 maybe was the better choice, but Black was never going to enjoy this, and it's hard to criticize Vladimir not wanting to hold this endgame for another 4 hours with uncertain success rate. And the most obvious, I guess, option in the position is to try something like b5, bishop b3, and a5 straight away. And this is playable, but also just to illustrate how dangerous this position is, the computer suggests that you can play bishop b3, and if Black plays a4, the bishop transfers over to d4, and then basically White starts playing for mate with something like rook e3, g3 to come. The bishop goes to c2. Nobody really, like White stops caring about the d5 pawn completely and just switches to full-on attack mode. And this is arguably already close to lost for Black. So a4 is a very, very large mistake in this position. You're supposed to play queen f5. But here as well, Black is not entirely equal. Maybe this was stronger than what Kramnik played, but this position is still quite dangerous for him after something like c4, bc4, and bishop takes c4. And yes, the pawn on d5 will fall. For instance, you can take with the knight. But White has all kinds of initiative after something like bishop d3, followed by bishop e4. Maybe you hold this, maybe you don't, but White is very much in control here. Kramnik played rook c8 instead. And this recreates the threat of knight takes d5. I probably should have mentioned that a seemingly useful tactic for Black, taking twice on d5 and then picking up the bishop on f4, doesn't work because there's a rook hanging on a8. And once you play rook c8, you very much re-establish this threat. And Ian played rook e4, which protects all of these pieces and stops the idea of knight takes d5. Bishop e3 was quite strong as a different approach with the same ideas of just getting it to d4 and then giving mate on the king side. But rook e4 is perfectly sensible, keeping control over the e-file for the time being, especially since I think Kramnik has shown a very marked unwillingness to play rook e8. And also, if you play rook e8 now, there is an additional option available to White of playing f2, f3, and saying to Black, if you want to trade these rooks, you will have include my improve my structure a little bit, create additional breakpoints that I can aim for. Kramnik played b5, bishop b3, a5. Once again, very understandable idea, trying to drive the bishop away from b3 and the protection of the pawn on d5. But a very, very simple move a2, a3, which Ian played, keeps everything under control. And Black is actually in a tremendous amount of trouble here. It's already a very unpleasant position. Once again, maybe in terms of safety, it was best to try and trade the rooks off, but this endgame is quite bad. And if you play at a6, which once again arguably is stronger than the move made by Kramnik in the game, White is quite significantly better, although it would have required from Ian to find, for the largest available advantage, Ian would have to find this idea of playing rook e4, e3 here, seemingly leaving the bishop, but there's a very simple tactic that picks up the queen in reply. After rook e3, Black plays knight c5, White goes bishop c2, and then once again switches basically to giving mate, rook g3, bishop e3, d4. If you take on d5 here, hoping for queen takes d5 and queen takes f4, White can introduce bishop takes h6 first. This bishop has to be picked up, and then White takes on d5, and all kinds of threats are very, very dangerous here. For instance, after queen f6, there is a very nice geometrical shot, queen c6, attacking the rook, queen cannot be taken because mate in 1 follows, and white just wins the pawn on b5. So the position is already very, very critical after a5, a3. Kramnik played queen f5, attacking the rook, attacking the pawn, obviously, but there's a very simple move, rook d4, in reply, which is very sufficient in holding everything together. Now the pawn on d6 is hanging. Kramnik tries to solve his problems by tactical means. He was also running quite short on time here, so he played queen b1 check, bishop d1, and b5, b4. And this almost succeeds, but not quite. C takes b4 is the only move that gives anything. Knight b5. And here I suspect maybe when Kramnik was playing a5 on move 24, he may have missed exactly the move that Ian Nepomniachtchi made in this position. Because if you make the most obvious move in the position here, rook d3, black plays rook c3, and pretty much forces the endgame after takes on c3, queen takes d1, checking, h2, and you can take on d5, and black will make a draw here. He might end up losing the d6 pawn after queen g3, but it doesn't really matter because this type of opposite colored bishop ending with 1 extra pawn and queens on the board is a very, very trivial draw in general. But unfortunately for black, there is this intermediate move, queen d3, attacking the queen and attacking the knight on b5. And now black's choices are quite bleak. You can go takes, let's say a4, a takes b4, and some move like rook a8. But I don't think you expect to hold this very often. Black is down a pawn. White also has 2 bishops against the bishop and knight, outside passer on the b file. It's not completely hopeless because the rook will become active via a1, let's say b1. But it's a bad position which you will, I think, lose more often than draw. And after queen a1, which looks logical, reaffirming the attack on the d4 rook, you cannot take the knight on b5 because queen takes d4, and black attacks absolutely everything and should not be worse at all here. Play 4, and black is still in a lot of trouble because he is currently a pawn down. The knight on b5 hangs in many lines, and if you make the obvious move knight c3, the rook just returns to e1, and you just never win this pawn back. If you play queen takes 3 here, white just switches once again to mating attacks. Bishop h5 is very strong with the intention of playing queen f5 in some positions, or even bishop takes f7. Also, c2 forces to play g7, g6, which looks unbelievably ugly, and it's very difficult to believe that black will not get mated somehow in a position like this. So what you should do here with black, I think, is to take on b4, take on d1, and go queen a4. And sort of similar things apply to this position that I said about the endgame a couple of moves earlier. It's better than what Vladimir Kramnik did in the game, but the position is really, really unpleasant. White does need to play queen b1 here to not allow any immediate trades, but after queen b1, the pawn on d6 is weak, the b pawn might start running at some point, and you're not at all sure you will save this. But in practical terms, this is what Kramnik should have done. But he kept on trying for, I think he maybe still harbored some hopes of complete equality here. And with a view of that, he played bishop takes d5, hoping for queen d5, knight c3, where instantly black's problems are gone. But white can just play rook e1, which is what Ian played. And also, once again, all of this was happening when Ian had, I think, more than half an hour left, and Kramnik was in severe time trouble, and this is with 10 moves to go. So I think maybe it was difficult for him to evaluate all these things properly on such a short time remaining. Both of his light pieces are hanging now, so you more or less have to play bishop c4, queen f5. Queen d2 is also very strong, creating the threat of bishop g4, protecting the rook on e1. Black more or less has to take on a3, and you can take on a5 here. And this position, the computer suggests, is also incredibly bad for black. But queen f5 is much more natural. attacking the rook on c8 and also bringing the queen closer to the black king, where very often it will participate in the mating attack. The computer suggests the best move in the position is rook a8, but it's also pretty bad, and there's any number of moves here which lead to huge advantages to white. For instance, queen d7, creating an incredibly strong threat of queen c6, which is surprisingly difficult to meet in a position like this. Kramnik instead played rook f8, and the next move, I think, is maybe the only decision Jan made in the entire game which you can criticize as significantly imprecise. But I'm sure it was heavily influenced by the fact that he was playing against somebody sort of running on fumes in terms of time management, and he wanted to make a move which creates the biggest immediate threat, and he also wanted to play it fast, I'm pretty sure. So Jan played king h2, creating a very nice threat of bishop c2, attacking the queen and attacking the h7 square. It's obviously important that queen takes e1 is no longer a check with the king on h2, so this threat was not present in the previous position. But had Kramnik found queen 4 here, the game would have become more difficult to win for Jan, because black is threatening queen takes f2. He also wants to play g6 in some positions, and the computer suggests that I believe the best line for white to maintain his advantage would be to play bishop c2, g6, queen g4, knight takes a3, and rook d1, continuing to juggle all of his pieces and kind of combining new threats to the black king with bringing the pieces to better squares. But playing something like this already requires at least some precision. White is still significantly better, maybe even winning, but you no longer win a position like this on autopilot. You will have to think about your moves. And if after rook f8 Jan plays a move I was suggesting, let's say during the live show, bishop takes h6, I think he wins this game on autopilot because it's an important pawn. It also creates additional threats to the black king side if black just ignores it. And if you take on h6, queen g4 check followed by queen takes c4 leads to positions which are just optically completely winning for white. There's also a very beautiful win in this position which starts with b takes a5, but I think bishop h6 is stronger because after b takes a5 you basically need to see that after queen c3, rook e3, queen c1, white is completely winning after giving the d1 bishop with check. In this position it turns out that black is sort of completely helpless against the threat of bishop takes h6 and queen f6 as well in some positions. So I believe the best line available to black in this position runs queen f6, bishop h6, queen e5, barely stopping white from giving mate. And now white just switches to this endgame, and now after, let's say, rook g5, you can pick up additional pawns, and you should be winning this position eventually. Maybe even that eventually is not that far off, because generally two light pieces against the rook and passers on both sides, because white will eventually also create a passer on the h file to go with his two passers on the a file. White is completely winning here, but after queen c3, to correctly assess that you don't have to worry about the bishop on d1 at all and just give it up with check is very, very easy for the machine, but not that easy for a human. Whereas after bishop takes h6, I have absolutely no doubt that the game can be converted into a full point by most able men, so to speak, and women. But instead Jan played king h2, and also, I mean, it's hard to criticize a move which led to an almost immediate victory, spoiler alert. But as mentioned, had Kramnik found queen d4, Jan would have to start thinking. Kramnik did not fight queen d4, he played g6, and after that Jan did not really have to consider very many things. Queen e4 is by far the most obvious move, attacking the bishop on c4. You can play g4, but then now after takes, basically any move wins. ba wins, bishop takes d6 wins, rook e4 wins, everything wins. You don't play d4 in a practical game. You play d5, which is what Kramnik did. And now after queen e7, there are just too many threats. The pawn on e5 is hanging, Pawn on h6 is hanging, and kind of more importantly, after a takes b4, for instance, which is what Kramnik played, on very, very low remaining time, of course, because it is a bit of a blunder. White also has the idea of bishop b5, and when the queen goes somewhere, White plays queen f6 and just gives mate on long diagonal. So Kramnik just resigned in this position. All in all, I think a very, very nicely played game by Ian Nepomniachtchi, and as I mentioned at the start of the video, this is less of a self-inflicted wound than we originally thought when we were commenting on the game live. I believe, as is often, I think, the case with positions in this variation, in particular this variation with 13d5, they are surprisingly venomous, and it's very easy to lose track of the moment where the position stops being equal and starts being objectively very, very unpleasant. And I have a feeling maybe even Kramnik himself today did not catch that moment properly and was soundly punished for that transgression. So all in all, very nicely played by Jan, who leads the tournament on 2.5 out of 3, having played the reigning world champion, an ex-world champion, and Anish Giri, who is very, very strong. Two people chase him on 2 out of 3, Ding Liren, who won a very interesting and theoretically important game against the young Dutch player Jordan van Foreest, and Vishy Anand, who won against Jordan in round 1. Round 4 starts at the same time, 13:30 Central European time tomorrow, so consider tuning in and watching the live broadcast, and consider going premium if you haven't yet, because why not? I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24, and I hope to see you tomorrow.